She went on her usual hike and noticed some rails going straight into the ground. When she went down there, she realized that this place wasn't hidden by accident. What was going on under the forest turned out to be way more dangerous than she could have imagined. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Eleanor Rains had not told anyone where she was going, not because the place itself was secret, but because the act of leaving without explanation felt like the last remaining freedom she still possessed. At 47, she had learned that silence could be a form of protection. Words invited questions, and questions demanded answers she no longer had the strength to give. The trailhead lay several miles beyond the last service road, where the asphalt thinned into cracked concrete and then disappeared altogether beneath gravel and weeds. Her car stood alone beneath a sky already pale with early light, its paint dulled by dust and distance. Eleanor closed the door, listened to the hollow echo fade into the hills, and for a moment simply stood there, breathing. The air was thinner than she was used to, cooler, carrying the faint metallic scent of stone and elevation. It was the kind of air that made the lungs work harder and the mind grow quiet. She adjusted the straps of her pack with practiced movements, though it had been years since she had last gone on a hike this long, this remote. The muscles remembered even if the rest of her life had drifted. She checked the map once more, not because she doubted the route, but because routine had always been her anchor. Folded paper, marked lines, distances measured and accounted for. Structure had once been her world. Before all of this, Eleanor had been an architect, not a famous one, not the kind whose name appeared in magazines or on plaques, but respected within her circle. She had designed municipal buildings, schools, modest housing developments, structures meant to last, structures meant to keep people safe. For 20 years, she had lived inside blueprints and calculations, load tolerances and stress factors, believing that if something was designed carefully enough, thoughtfully enough, it would hold. Then the firm had closed. It had not been dramatic. No scandal, no collapse. Just a slow tightening of budgets, projects canceled or outsourced, contracts slipping away. Her marriage had ended around the same time, not with shouting or betrayal, but with exhaustion. Two people sitting across from each other at a kitchen table, realizing they no longer recognized the life they had built together. When her husband left, he took his books and his clothes and his quiet disappointment. Eleanor was left with an apartment full of echoes and a profession that no longer seemed to want her. She had tried to stay, tried consulting work, temporary contracts, endless applications that went unanswered. Eventually, even the act of trying began to feel performative, as though she were reenacting a life rather than living one. The decision to hike had come not as inspiration, but as surrender. She needed to step outside the world that kept reminding her of everything she was no longer needed for. The region she had chosen was officially listed as restricted. Geological instability, the warning signs said. Risk of sinkholes, landslides, subsurface erosion. It was enough to keep tourists away, enough to ensure solitude. Eleanor had seen such designations before. Sometimes they were genuine, sometimes they were convenient. The trail began gently, winding through low scrub and sparse pine, the ground firm beneath her boots. As the sun rose higher, the light stretched across the slopes, revealing a landscape that felt oddly unfinished, as though something had interrupted its natural progression. The hills were steep but strangely uniform, their angles too consistent, their ridgelines cut with a precision that nagged at the back of her mind. She walked steadily, letting the rhythm of her steps pull her forward. With each mile, the signal on her phone weakened, then vanished entirely. She did not turn back. The absence of connection felt like relief. No emails, no notifications, no reminders of obligations she could no longer fulfill. The silence was profound, but not peaceful in the way she had expected. It pressed inward rather than outward, heavy and watchful. She realized, after some time, that she could not hear birds. There were no distant calls, no sudden fluttering of wings. Even insects seemed scarce. The wind moved through the grass without sound, bending it in slow, deliberate waves. Eleanor paused to drink from her canteen and studied the slope ahead. According to her map, this section should have been rougher, more broken. Instead, the ground rose in a long, steady incline, the stone beneath the soil packed and stable in a way that suggested intervention. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. It was cool, compacted, almost polished beneath the thin layer of dust and moss. She stood slowly, a familiar unease settling into her chest. It was the same feeling she used to get when reviewing a set of plans that looked correct at first glance, but failed under closer inspection. Everything aligned too well. Nature, she knew, was not this tidy. As she continued upward, she noticed markers along the trail that did not appear on her map. Short metal posts, partially buried, spaced at regular intervals. No labels, no numbers. They were placed with intention, not randomly driven into the ground. She stopped beside one and brushed away dirt with her boot. The metal was not old. It bore faint scratches, the kind left by recent contact. Her pace slowed. She became aware of her surroundings in a new way, scanning the ground, the rock faces, the spaces between trees. That was when she saw it. A line cutting across the slope at a shallow angle, barely visible beneath the moss and gravel. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the uneven terrain. But as she stepped closer, the line resolved into something unmistakably straight. She crouched, heart beating faster now, and cleared away debris with her hands. Metal emerged beneath the dirt, darkened, but intact. Another strip ran parallel to it a short distance away, connected by evenly spaced cross ties buried just below the surface. Eleanor froze, staring down at the discovery. Rail tracks. Not the wide gauge used by freight trains, but narrow, industrial, designed for controlled loads rather than speed. She traced the line with her eyes, following it as it disappeared under a thicker layer of earth farther down the slope. The ties were weathered, but solid. The bolts showed signs of corrosion, but only superficial. This was not a relic from a century ago. This was infrastructure that had been maintained. Her mind began to work despite her efforts to quiet it. Narrow-gauge rails were used in mining operations, in subterranean transport systems. She had seen them in old schematics, in archival photographs. But there were no mines recorded in this area, none that were legal, at least. She rose and followed the tracks, moving slowly now, alert to every sound and shift in the ground. The rails led her toward a shallow depression between two rock outcrops. As she approached, the air grew cooler, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell that stung her nose. Not rot, not damp earth, something sharper, industrial. The ground dropped away suddenly. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the depression and stared down. What she had taken for a natural hollow revealed itself as a fresh collapse. The soil had caved inward, forming a jagged opening several meters across. Loose rock and dirt clung to the edges, while the interior vanished into darkness. The rails continued straight into the void, disappearing beneath the broken earth, as though they had been swallowed whole. She knelt and leaned forward carefully. The sides of the opening were uneven near the top, but lower down she could see smooth surfaces, reinforced, shaped. The beam of her flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls that bore the unmistakable marks of human design. Struts, cut stone, a tunnel. A breath of cold air rose from below, carrying the same metallic scent, stronger now, mixed with oil and something chemical. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, She felt it rather than heard it. A vibration, steady and low, like the distant hum of machinery. Eleanor sat back on her heels, her thoughts racing. This was not on any map. This was not abandoned. Whatever lay beneath this mountain was active, hidden behind warnings and omission. She thought of the restricted designation, the empty silence of the land, the markers without labels. All of it aligned into a picture she did not yet fully understand, but could no longer ignore. She should leave. That was the rational choice. Mark the location, hike back out, report it. But to whom? Authorities who had either overlooked this or chosen not to see it. She imagined making the call, explaining what she had found, only to be told it was classified, none of her concern. The thought filled her with a quiet anger. For most of her life, Eleanor had trusted systems, regulations, oversight. She had believed that if something was dangerous, someone would mark it, secure it, make it known. Standing at the edge of the collapse, she realized how fragile that belief had been. She adjusted her pack and rose to her feet. The descent would be risky. She could see that. The edges were unstable, the drop steep, but the tunnel walls below were solid, designed to bear weight, designed to endure. Eleanor took one last look at the trail behind her, at the empty mountains stretching away into silence. Then she turned back to the opening, set her jaw, and began to climb down toward the darkness, unaware that the choice she had just made would draw her into something far larger than herself, something that had been buried deliberately and would not yield its secrets without consequence. The moment Eleanor's boots touched the sloped interior of the collapse, she understood that the descent itself was already part of the story the mountain had been hiding. The soil near the opening was loose, crumbling under her weight, but just a few feet lower, the texture changed. Her foot met resistance that was too firm, too uniform. She steadied herself, pressed her palm against the wall, and felt the difference immediately. This was not raw earth. This was shaped, compacted, reinforced. She paused, breathing carefully, listening. The hum she had sensed above was more distinct now, not loud enough to identify as machinery, but persistent, rhythmic. It was the kind of sound engineers learned to recognize early in their careers, the vibration of something operational, something designed to move energy or matter from one place to another. It did not belong beneath a mountain marked on maps as unstable and abandoned. Her flashlight beam swept slowly across the interior, revealing the rails more clearly now. They emerged from beneath the collapsed soil and continued downward, disappearing into the tunnel beyond. Eleanor crouched beside them, brushing dust and gravel from the metal with her glove. The railhead was worn smooth, polished by repeated contact. She traced the curve of it with her fingers, her mind cataloging details automatically. This was narrow-gauge track, engineered for controlled loads, likely for ore carts or industrial wagons. The spacing of the ties was precise. The bolts were modern, hex-headed, not the square fasteners used in older installations. She swallowed hard. If these rails had been abandoned decades ago, corrosion would have eaten deeper. The ties would have shifted, warped by freeze and thaw. Instead, everything was aligned, functional, maintained. The mountain had not simply swallowed a relic of the past. Someone had placed this here with intent, and someone had kept it alive. Eleanor stood and followed the rails deeper, moving slowly now, aware of the precariousness of the ground beneath her. The tunnel widened gradually, its ceiling arcing overhead with deliberate curvature. The walls bore tool marks, not crude or chaotic, but consistent, the kind left by modern cutting equipment. She recognized the geometry instinctively. This was not improvised excavation. It was planned. As she walked, she noted other details. Small recesses cut into the walls at regular intervals, likely for equipment or lighting. ventilation shafts angled upward, disappearing into darkness, some emitting faint currents of air. She passed a junction where a secondary tunnel branched off, its rails diverging before vanishing into shadow. She marked the spot mentally, though she knew her sense of direction would soon be tested. The smell grew stronger the farther she went. Oil, unmistakable now, mixed with something sharper that burned faintly at the back of her throat. Chemical. Industrial waste, perhaps. It reminded her of construction sites she had visited during inspections, places where machinery and materials coexisted in uneasy balance. But those sites had permits, oversight, safety protocols. This place had secrecy. Her thoughts returned to the surface, to the warning signs posted miles away, vague and nonspecific. Geological instability, a convenient explanation. She had seen it before, during urban redevelopment projects, where old infrastructure lay buried beneath new foundations. Sometimes, it was easier to declare an area unsafe than to explain what was truly beneath it. She stopped again when her flashlight caught a glint on the wall to her right, a metal plate, bolted into the stone, partially obscured by dust. She stepped closer and wiped it clean. There were no company logos, no identifying marks, only a serial number etched deeply into the surface. She took out her phone and photographed it, though she knew there was no signal to transmit the image. Still, documentation mattered. Habit, ingrained from years of professional accountability. As she straightened, she noticed the floor beneath her boots had changed. The packed dirt gave way to concrete, smooth but stained, with dark streaks where liquid had pooled and evaporated. She knelt and touched one of the stains, then brought her fingers to her nose. The smell was unmistakable. Petroleum. Raw, unrefined. Eleanor sat back on her heels, her pulse quickening. This was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. This was evidence. Evidence of extraction, transport, and processing happening beneath a mountain that, according to public records, contained nothing of value. She rose and continued, her steps cautious now, her awareness sharpened by the knowledge that this place wasn't empty. Somewhere, people had been here recently. Somewhere, machinery was still running. The tunnel sloped downward at a steady grade, designed to allow loaded carts to move efficiently. She imagined them rolling along these rails, carrying whatever had been taken from the mountain, disappearing into unseen chambers. The thought made her chest tighten. Whatever was happening here had scale, planning, investment. She reached another junction and hesitated. The left branch descended more steeply, its rails slick with oil. The right continued at the same gentle incline. She chose the right, reasoning that it was more likely to lead toward the original access point, wherever that might be. As she moved forward, the air grew warmer. Her skin prickled, sweat forming at the base of her neck despite the coolness of the stone around her. The hum she had sensed earlier was louder now, joined by a faint hiss, like pressure being released in controlled bursts. She slowed, her heart pounding, every instinct telling her she was getting closer to the core of whatever operation this was. Then the ground shifted beneath her. It was subtle at first, a vibration that traveled through the soles of her boots, followed by a dull crack. She froze, listening. Another crack echoed through the tunnel, sharper this time, and before she could react, the wall to her left shuddered. A section of ceiling gave way with a roar, sending debris cascading down in a cloud of dust and stone. Eleanor threw herself backward, shielding her head as the air filled with grit. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she felt a sharp pain flare along her shoulder as she hit the ground. When the noise subsided, she lay still, gasping, the world reduced to darkness and ringing silence. Slowly, she sat up, coughing, her flashlight beam trembling as she tried to steady it. The tunnel behind her was partially blocked now, a mound of rubble where there had been open passage moments before. She tested her shoulder, wincing at the pain, but relieved to find she could still move it. Her ankle throbbed, but held. She stood unsteadily and approached the collapse. The debris was fresh, unstable. Even if she could climb it, disturbing it further risked another cave-in. Her way back was no longer clear. Eleanor leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment as the reality of her situation settled in. She was injured, alone, and cut off from the surface in an illegal industrial tunnel beneath a restricted mountain. Panic threatened to rise, but she forced it down, focusing instead on what she knew how to do best: assess, analyze, plan. She checked her supplies: flashlight, spare batteries, water. Limited, but not gone. Her phone, useless for communication, still functioned as a camera and clock. She took a photograph of the collapse, marking the time automatically. Documentation, even now. She moved forward cautiously, away from the blockage, her senses alert to any further signs of instability. The tunnel narrowed slightly, its walls closing in, the ceiling lowering. She could feel the heat more intensely now, the air thickening, each breath requiring effort. The smell of oil was stronger here, joined by a sour undertone that made her eyes sting. She rounded a bend and stopped abruptly. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. The rails ended abruptly at its edge, disappearing beneath a shallow pool of dark liquid that reflected her flashlight beam dully. The surface shimmered with an oily sheen. On the far side, pipes ran along the wall, some capped, others open, dripping slowly into the pool below. The sound of the drip echoed in the space, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Eleanor stepped closer, careful to avoid the liquid, and shined her light upward. The ceiling was reinforced with metal ribs, bolted into the stone. Cables ran alongside them, disappearing into conduits. This was not an abandoned space. This was a functional node, part of a larger system. Her mind raced. She had crossed a threshold. Whatever lay beyond this chamber was deeper, more central, and likely more dangerous. Turning back was no longer an option. Forward was the only path left, even as her body protested and her fear grew. She lowered herself onto a dry section of concrete near the wall, her back resting against the cool stone. For the first time since she had entered the tunnel, Eleanor allowed herself to stop moving. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind exhaustion and pain. Her breathing came in shallow bursts as she stared into the darkness ahead. She thought of her life above ground, of the choices that had led her here. She had come seeking silence, escape, a pause from a world that no longer seemed to need her. Instead, she had found something that demanded attention, accountability, witness. A bitter smile touched her lips. Even here, beneath a mountain, she could not escape responsibility. The hum pulsed through the stone around her, steady and indifferent. Somewhere deeper in the mountain, something continued to work, unaware or unconcerned with the woman sitting against its walls. Eleanor closed her eyes, her head falling back against the stone, and for the first time since the descent, doubt crept in. Had she gone too far? She opened her eyes again and stared into the darkness, knowing that the question no longer mattered. The mountain had already drawn her in, and whatever truth lay beneath it would not remain buried, simply because she wished it so. For a long time, Eleanor did not move. She sat with her back pressed against the cold stone, her legs drawn slightly inward, her hands resting limply on her knees as if they no longer quite belonged to her. The chamber before her breathed with a slow, mechanical patience, the hum traveling through the reinforced ribs in the ceiling and into her bones. Each pulse felt deliberate, controlled, as though the mountain itself had been repurposed into a living machine. Her shoulder throbbed in time with the vibration. The pain was not sharp anymore, but deep and insistent, a reminder of the collapse behind her. She turned her head slightly and shone her flashlight back toward the passage she had come from. The rubble was still there, a jagged barrier of broken stone and earth, dust clinging to the edges like ash. Nothing had shifted since she last looked. The way back remained sealed. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to breathe through her nose despite the acrid sting. Panic would waste air, waste time. Years of inspections and emergency protocols returned to her with unexpected clarity. When something went wrong on a construction site, the worst thing a person could do was rush. Assess first. Then, act. She rose carefully, testing her ankle before committing her weight to it. It held, though the joint protested. She adjusted the strap of her pack, tightening it across her chest to steady herself, and turned her attention back to the chamber. The pool of dark liquid stretched farther than she had first realized, its surface broken only by slow drips from the pipes overhead. Each drop sent ripples across the oily film, catching the light and scattering it in distorted patterns across the walls. The smell here was stronger, layered, no longer just oil, but something treated, altered. Chemical additives, she guessed. Processing, not just extraction. She moved along the edge of the pool, careful to keep her boots on dry concrete. The floor bore faint grooves, marks left by repeated movement of heavy objects. Carts, perhaps. Or machinery rolled into place and removed again. This space was transitional, a junction between transport and operation. On the far side, the tunnel continued, broader now, its ceiling higher, the walls lined with conduits and brackets that once held lights. Some still did. As she stepped forward, one flickered faintly, casting a dull yellow glow that barely supplemented her flashlight. The fact that it still worked sent a chill through her. Someone was maintaining this. The tunnel beyond sloped downward again, the incline steeper than before. Eleanor followed it slowly, counting her steps, forcing herself to remain oriented. She dragged her fingers lightly along the wall as she walked, feeling the texture change beneath her touch. The stone here was smoother, almost polished, the result of repeated vibration and contact. In places, the wall bore faint geometric markings, etched not as symbols, but as guides. Alignment marks used during excavation. She paused beside one and studied it, her mind automatically reconstructing the process that would have created it. Laser-guided drilling. Precision boring. This was not a small operation hidden hastily underground. This was a project that required planning, expertise, and significant funding. The thought made her stomach tighten. As she continued, she began to notice other signs of recent activity. A discarded glove lay crumpled near the wall, its fabric stained dark. Footprints marked the dust on the floor, overlapping, some heavier than others. She crouched and examined them, noting the tread patterns. Industrial boots, standard issue. Her isolation deepened with every step. This was not an abandoned place where she might stumble upon forgotten machinery and walk away with a strange story. This was a place where people worked, where routines existed, where schedules were kept. And she did not belong here. The tunnel curved sharply to the left, and as she followed it, the hum grew louder, joined by a faint rhythmic clank that echoed down the passage. Her heart began to race despite her efforts to remain calm. She slowed further, placing each foot carefully, listening between breaths. Ahead, the tunnel ceiling dipped, forcing her to crouch slightly. The air was hotter here, heavy enough that each inhale felt insufficient. Sweat trickled down her spine, soaking into her shirt. Her flashlight beam trembled as she adjusted her grip, her fingers slick. She emerged into another chamber, smaller than the last, but far more unsettling. The walls here were lined with equipment. Not the massive machinery she had half expected, but control units. Monitors bolted into the stone, their screens dark but intact. Thick cables ran along the floor and up into the ceiling, disappearing through drilled channels. A metal ladder was fixed to the wall on the far side, leading upward into darkness. Eleanor approached one of the control units and wiped dust from its surface. Beneath the grime, a faint logo was visible, half scratched away. Letters, partially obscured. She leaned closer, squinting in the low light, but could not make them out clearly. Whatever company name had once been displayed here had been deliberately defaced. She stepped back, her mind racing. Why hide this? Why go to such lengths to erase identifiers while leaving the infrastructure itself intact? It suggested not abandonment, but caution. Fear of discovery. A sudden sound froze her in place. It came from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, a low rumble followed by a sharp hiss, like pressure being released. The hum intensified briefly, then settled back into its steady rhythm. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. That sound had not been structural. It had been mechanical. She was not alone beneath the mountain. The realization drained what little warmth she had left. She turned slowly, scanning the chamber for any sign of movement, her flashlight beam darting from wall to wall. Shadows leapt and retreated, but nothing else stirred. Still, the sense of being observed pressed in on her, heavy and undeniable. She backed away from the control units and leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow now. She had gone too far. The thought arrived fully formed, undeniable. Whatever she had hoped to find here, she had found something far more dangerous. Her gaze drifted to the ladder. It offered a possible way up, perhaps to another access point, another exit, or perhaps to the heart of the operation. She could not know, but remaining where she was felt increasingly untenable. She took a step toward it, then stopped. Her leg gave out beneath her. Pain flared white-hot along her ankle as it twisted under her weight. She cried out, the sound echoing off the stone, sharp and uncontrollable. The noise seemed to hang in the air, magnified, before being swallowed by the hum. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, clutching her ankle as the pain radiated upward. Tears blurred her vision, unbidden. She pressed her forehead to the concrete, breathing through clenched teeth, waiting for the worst to pass. When she finally looked up, the chamber seemed different, smaller, more oppressive. The ladder loomed above her, unreachable now without support. Her flashlight lay on the floor beside her, its beam pointed uselessly at the wall. She reached for it and sat up slowly, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. The reality of her situation settled fully into place. She was injured, lost, trapped beneath an active industrial operation that should not exist. And she had made noise. She listened intently, straining to hear any response, any sign that her cry had been heard. The hum continued, unbroken. No voices. No footsteps. Either no one was close enough to hear her, or whoever was operating this place was accustomed to ignoring sounds that did not belong. A wave of despair washed over her, stronger than fear. Not panic, but something heavier, more final. She thought of the trail above, of the quiet mountains she had entered seeking escape. She thought of her empty apartment, of the life she had stepped away from without ceremony. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she had already disappeared long before coming here. Eleanor slid back against the wall, her head resting against the stone. She let her flashlight fall to her side, conserving its battery, and closed her eyes. For a moment, she considered staying there, letting the exhaustion take her. The thought was not dramatic or emotional. It was simply a calculation. How long she could last, how much air she was using, how likely it was that anyone would find her. The answer, she knew, was not encouraging. The mountain did not care. The machinery did not care. Whatever system had been built here would continue to function with or without her. Her breath hitched, and she opened her eyes again, staring at the rough stone inches from her face. A quiet anger stirred beneath the despair, faint but persistent. She had spent her life designing spaces meant to protect people, to serve them. And here she was, buried beneath a system designed to hide, to exploit, to erase accountability. If this place existed, if it was active, then it was wrong. And if it was wrong, someone needed to know. The thought did not give her strength, not yet, but it anchored her. She shifted her position slightly, easing the pressure on her ankle, and waited. Not for rescue, not for hope, just for a moment of clarity in which she could decide what to do next. Above her, unseen, the mountain held its secrets. Below her, machinery worked on, indifferent. And between them, Eleanor sat alone in the dim light, the weight of the earth pressing down, her resolve worn thin but not yet broken. Time lost its shape beneath the mountain. Eleanor could not tell how long she had been sitting there, her back against the stone, her injured ankle drawn close, her breathing slow and shallow in an effort to conserve strength. The hum of the machinery had become a constant presence, no longer startling, but deeply unsettling in its steadiness. It was the sound of something that didn't sleep, didn't hesitate, didn't care. Her thoughts drifted in uneven currents. At times they were sharp and focused, replaying every decision that had led her here with brutal clarity. At other moments they dulled, slipping toward memories that felt safer. The drafting table by the window of her old office, the smell of coffee in the early mornings before deadlines, the quiet satisfaction of watching a building rise exactly as it had existed for months, only on paper. She clung to those images not out of nostalgia, but because they reminded her that she had once been capable, trusted, necessary. The air grew heavier as minutes passed. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last. She shifted slightly, wincing as pain flared in her ankle, then settled again, forcing herself to remain still. Movement wasted energy. Panic wasted more. It was then, in the space between one breath and the next, that she heard it. At first, she thought it was another mechanical sound, a variation in the hum. But this was different, irregular, soft, distant, and unmistakably human. A faint scrape, followed by the muted clink of metal against stone. Eleanor froze. She held her breath and listened, every muscle tensing despite her exhaustion. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Controlled, deliberate, not hurried. The cadence was wrong for workers moving through a familiar space. These steps were cautious, measured, as though the person making them was assessing the environment with care. A voice followed, low and calm, echoing faintly through the tunnel. Surface Patrol, Sector 3. Checking anomaly marker. The word sent a shock through her. She did not move, did not call out. She had no idea who this person was, no idea whether revealing herself would bring help or danger. Her experience with systems had taught her that uniforms did not always mean safety. The footsteps approached slowly, the beam of a light sweeping across the tunnel walls ahead. Eleanor pressed herself closer to the stone, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard. The light reached the chamber. It lingered first on the pool of dark liquid, then on the pipes and control units. The beam paused, shifted, then landed on her. "Hey," the voice said, sharper now. "Don't move." She raised one hand instinctively, palm outward, her other hand gripping the concrete for support. The man stepped fully into the chamber, his light trained on her face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark uniform marked with subdued insignia. A rifle was slung across his chest, his posture alert, but not aggressive. "Are you injured?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "My ankle and my shoulder." He studied her for a moment longer, his gaze flicking to her pack, her boots, the flashlight lying near her hand. Then he lowered his weapon slightly and approached, keeping a careful distance. "You're not supposed to be down here," he said, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. "I know," she replied. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hoarse and unsteady. "Neither is this." His eyes followed the direction of her gaze, taking in the equipment lining the walls, the ladder, the cables. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The look of someone seeing a piece of information that did not fit with what they had been told. "What were you doing?" he asked. "Hiking," Eleanor said. "I found a collapse, rails leading into it. This tunnel." He frowned. "Rails?" She gestured weakly behind her. "Narrow gauge, industrial. They're not old." The man turned slightly, sweeping his light back down the tunnel she had come from. He took in the rails, the marks on the floor, the reinforced walls. His jaw tightened. "This area is classified as geologically unstable," he said slowly. "No active operations." "There are," Eleanor replied. "They're running something down here. Oil, maybe. Chemicals. I don't know. But it's active. And it's hidden." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Command," he said, keeping his voice low. "I've located a civilian in the anomaly zone, injured. And there's infrastructure down here that's not on any of my maps." A pause. Eleanor could not hear the response, but she saw the muscles in his neck tense. "Yes," he continued. "Confirmed. Reinforced tunnels. Equipment. Active systems. No, I don't see any corporate markings yet." Another pause. "Understood," he said finally. "Requesting authorization for extended inspection and extraction." He lowered his hand and turned back to Eleanor. "Can you stand?" "I can try," she said. He moved closer now, crouching beside her. "I'm going to help you up." Slowly. He supported her carefully as she rose, his grip firm and professional. Pain shot through her ankle, but she bit down on the sound that threatened to escape. She leaned heavily against him, grateful for the solid presence. "My name's Cole," he said as they stood. "Sergeant Cole Mason." "Eleanor," she replied. "Eleanor Rains." "All right, Eleanor," he said. "We're getting you out of here." As they moved toward the tunnel entrance, Cole's attention remained divided between her and the surroundings. He paused often, shining his light into corners, studying the equipment with a critical eye. At one point, he stopped beside a control unit and brushed dust from its surface, revealing more of the scratched-away logo. "Someone didn't want their name on this," he muttered. They reached the base of the ladder, and Cole tested it before guiding Eleanor's hand to the first rung. "Take it slow," he said. "I've got you." The climb was painful, but manageable with his help. At the top, the tunnel narrowed again, sloping upward. The air grew cooler with each step, the hum fading gradually behind them. As they walked, Eleanor explained what she had seen, her words spilling out now that someone was listening. The rails, the oil, the control units, the defaced markings. Cole listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with every detail. "This wasn't in any of our briefings," he said finally. "We're told this area's unstable. That's it. No mention of industrial activity." "That's the point," Eleanor said. "It's meant to stay hidden." They reached the collapsed section where Eleanor's path back had been blocked. Cole studied the rubble, then nodded to himself. "Recent," he said. "Too recent to be natural." He raised his radio again. "Command. Collapse appears secondary. Possible structural failure triggered by activity below. Recommending full investigation." This time, the response took longer. When Cole lowered his hand, his face was set. "They want me to extract you and secure the surface," he said. "Investigators will follow." "Will they?" Eleanor asked. He met her gaze. "I'm making sure they do." They emerged from the tunnel into daylight that felt almost unreal in its brightness. Eleanor blinked, breathing deeply as fresh air filled her lungs. The mountain spread out around them, silent and indifferent, giving no hint of what lay beneath. Cole helped her to a marked patrol vehicle parked near the edge of the restricted zone. He seated her carefully, wrapped her ankle, and offered her water. She drank greedily, the cool liquid grounding her. As he worked, other patrol units arrived, their presence transforming the quiet mountainside into a controlled scene. Equipment was unloaded. Coordinates were logged. Radios crackled with clipped reports. Eleanor watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. She had come seeking escape and emerged into escalation. Cole stood and looked back toward the tunnel entrance, now cordoned off with temporary barriers. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Not everyone would have gone down there, and fewer still would have spoken up." "I didn't plan to," Eleanor replied. "I just couldn't ignore it." He nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." As the patrol prepared to transport her, Eleanor glanced once more at the mountain. It looked unchanged, serene even. But she knew better now. Beneath its surface, something had been exposed. Not fully, not yet, but enough. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that what she had seen would not stay buried. Eleanor did not remember the ride down the mountain clearly. Later, fragments would return to her in pieces. The rhythmic sway of the patrol vehicle, the radio voices overlapping in clipped, controlled tones, the way the sunlight flickered through the windows as the road twisted downward. At the time, exhaustion wrapped around her like a second skin. Pain dulled into a distant, manageable presence, replaced by a heavier sensation, the weight of what she had seen and what it meant. By the time they reached the temporary command post, set up at the edge of the restricted zone, the situation had already begun to shift. What had started as a routine patrol response was becoming something else entirely. Vehicles she did not recognize stood parked in uneven rows, their markings unfamiliar. Men and women in different uniforms moved with purpose, carrying cases of equipment, unspooling cables, setting up lights and portable scanners. The mountain, which had seemed so silent and empty only hours before, now felt crowded with intent. Eleanor was helped out of the vehicle and guided to a folding chair beneath a canvas awning. A medic examined her ankle and shoulder with brisk efficiency, confirming what she already suspected: a severe sprain, deep bruising, nothing broken. As the medic worked, Eleanor's gaze drifted back toward the slope where the tunnel lay hidden behind barriers and warning tape. It looked unchanged, solid, impenetrable, as if nothing beneath it could possibly justify the sudden activity around it. Sergeant Mason stood nearby, speaking quietly with a man in a different uniform, one marked with insignia Eleanor did not recognize. Their conversation was brief but intense. She caught fragments of it when the wind shifted. Unauthorized infrastructure, active systems, environmental hazard. Words that carried weight. When Mason returned to her, his expression was composed, but tight. "They're bringing in specialists," he said. "Environmental assessment, structural analysis. This is already above my clearance." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And the reports?" "They're being filed," he replied. "Formally. With evidence, That mattered more to her than she could easily explain. Paper trails, documentation. She had built her career on the understanding that what was written down endured longer than intentions. A woman approached then, introducing herself as Dr. Lena Hart, an environmental response officer attached to a federal oversight unit. She spoke calmly, professionally, but Eleanor sensed a sharp focus beneath the surface. This was not curiosity. It was concern. "We'll need a full account of what you observed underground," Dr. Hart said. "As detailed as possible. Not just what you saw, but where, how it was arranged, the condition of the infrastructure." Eleanor took a breath and began. She spoke slowly at first, measuring her words, careful not to speculate beyond what she had directly observed. She described the rails, their condition, their orientation, the reinforced walls, the ventilation shafts, the control units with defaced markings, the oil pooled on the concrete, the pipes, the heat, the hum of machinery. As she talked, she saw the effect her words had. Dr. Hart's pen moved quickly, occasionally pausing as she asked Eleanor to clarify distances, slopes, relative positions. Others joined them as the account continued. An engineer, a geologist, a man in plain clothes who introduced himself only as an investigator. They listened, asked questions, exchanged glances that confirmed what Eleanor already knew. This was not a minor violation. At one point, Dr. Hart looked up from her notes. "Did you observe any active extraction equipment?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Not the main machinery itself, but the systems that support it. Pumps, processing nodes, control interfaces. This wasn't abandoned. It was operational." The investigator nodded slowly. "And you're certain this was beneath the restricted zone marked as unstable?" "I'm certain," Eleanor said. "I followed the rails from the collapse point. There was no indication of a decommissioned site. Everything was maintained." Silence followed her words, heavy and deliberate. By late afternoon, the perimeter had expanded. More vehicles arrived. Portable barriers replaced the temporary tape. Drones lifted into the air, their quiet buzz joining the hum of generators. Eleanor watched as the mountain was mapped and measured, its surface scanned for hidden voids and structural anomalies. She felt strangely detached from it all, as though she were observing the aftermath of an event she had only partially participated in. Yet every time she closed her eyes, the underground chambers returned with unsettling clarity. The heat, the smell, the sense of something working steadily beyond sight. A journalist arrived before sunset. He did not come rushing forward with a camera and a microphone. Instead, he waited at the edge of the command area, speaking quietly with one of the officials. When he finally approached Eleanor, he introduced himself politely and asked if she was willing to speak on record. Eleanor hesitated. For most of her life, she had avoided attention. She preferred drawings to declarations, calculations to confrontations. But as she looked around at the mountain, now under scrutiny, she understood that silence would not protect it, or anyone else. "Yes," she said. "I'll speak." They found a quiet spot near the edge of the perimeter. The journalist listened intently as Eleanor summarized her experience, careful again to distinguish observation from assumption. She spoke of the rails, the collapse, the tunnel system, the evidence of ongoing industrial activity. She spoke of how the area had been marked unstable without explanation. "What do you think was being taken from beneath the mountain?" the journalist asked. "I don't know for certain," Eleanor replied. "But whatever it wasn't meant to be public, and it wasn't safe." Her words appeared online before nightfall. By morning, the story had spread beyond the region. Environmental groups issued statements demanding transparency. Regulatory agencies announced preliminary inquiries. A company name began to circulate in speculation, though no official confirmation accompanied it. Eleanor spent the night in a nearby medical facility, her ankle elevated, her body heavy with exhaustion. Sleep came in shallow waves, interrupted by images of dark tunnels and flickering lights. When she woke, her phone was filled with messages she had not yet opened, requests for comment, offers of legal representation, questions from people she did not know. She ignored them all. Instead, she focused on the officials who returned that morning with updates. Core samples had confirmed contamination. Ground-penetrating scans revealed a network far larger than initially suspected, extending beyond the restricted zone into neighboring land. The scope of the operation was becoming impossible to dismiss. "They've been careful," Dr. Hart said, her voice low. "Too careful. This wasn't a temporary setup. This was designed to avoid detection for years." Eleanor thought of the defaced logos, the hidden access points, the warnings that said just enough to keep people away without drawing attention. She felt a familiar anger rise, steady and controlled. "This didn't just happen," she said. "It was planned." Dr. Hart met her gaze. "Yes," she said simply. "It was." By midday, the mountain was no longer quiet. News vans lined the access road. Cameras captured images of officials entering and exiting the restricted zone. The story had found its audience, and with it came pressure. Attempts were made to reframe the situation. Statements suggested outdated infrastructure, legacy operations, misunderstandings. But the evidence resisted simplification. Images from inside the tunnel, captured by inspection teams, showed modern equipment, recent modifications, active systems. Eleanor watched the coverage from a chair near the window of the facility, the mountain visible in the distance. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a sober understanding that the truth, once exposed, carried its own burden. Sergeant Mason visited her before his shift ended. "They're asking questions," he said. "A lot of them." "About me?" Eleanor asked. "About everything," he replied. "But especially about who authorized this." She nodded. "That's the question that matters." As evening fell, Eleanor was discharged with instructions to rest and avoid strain. She was offered transport home, but she declined. Instead, she asked to be taken back to the edge of the restricted zone. From there, she watched the lights glow against the darkening slope, illuminating the mountain's face. It looked wounded now, its secrecy breached, its silence broken. She knew the process ahead would be long. Investigations, hearings, reports, attempts to obscure responsibility, to reduce consequences. She had no illusions about how easily systems protected themselves. But something had changed. What lay beneath the mountain was no longer invisible, and neither was she. As night settled in, Eleanor wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and looked once more at the place where the rails had led her underground. She felt the weight of what she had set in motion, heavy but necessary. The truth had reached the surface, and it would not be buried again without a fight. The mountain did not change overnight. In the days that followed, Eleanor learned that truth rarely arrived with thunder. It came instead with paperwork, with measured voices and careful language, with people arriving in waves rather than floods. Yet even in that restraint, she sensed the magnitude of what had been set in motion. She returned to the area a week later, her ankle still wrapped, her movement slower, more deliberate. The road that had once ended in neglect now bore fresh tire tracks and temporary signage. Security checkpoints stood where there had been nothing but scrub and silence. The restricted zone had expanded, its boundaries redrawn with unmistakable authority. The land, once quietly avoided, was now watched. Eleanor parked at a designated turnout and stepped out of the vehicle, leaning briefly against the door as she adjusted her balance. The air smelled different. Cleaner, perhaps. Or maybe that was her imagination. Heavy equipment stood idle on the slope, their metal forms stark against the stone. Survey markers dotted the ground, like punctuation marks, in a sentence that had been left unfinished for too long. She walked slowly toward the overlook from which she could see the section of mountain that had drawn her underground. From this distance, there was no sign of the tunnel entrance. The collapse had been stabilized, its edges reinforced, the opening concealed beneath layers of protective material. To an untrained eye, it would look like nothing more than another scar in rugged terrain. But Eleanor knew what lay beneath. She thought of the maps she had been shown during briefings in the days since her rescue. Renderings created by ground-penetrating scans, lines branching and intersecting beneath the mountain like veins. The network extended farther than anyone had initially suspected, reaching under adjacent valleys, beneath land owned by people who had no idea what had been taken from below their feet. The operation had not been small. It had not been temporary. It had been systematic. Investigators arrived in stages, first environmental teams, then federal inspectors, then legal representatives, whose presence shifted the tone of every conversation. Names began to surface, some familiar to Eleanor only from the periphery of public life. Corporate entities layered beneath subsidiaries, each one claiming ignorance, each one distancing itself from responsibility. It was exhausting to watch, but Eleanor did not look away. She attended hearings when her ankle allowed, sitting quietly at the back of rooms filled with measured outrage and rehearsed concern. She listened as experts explained the environmental impact, the contamination risks, the structural dangers posed by years of unregulated excavation. She listened as lawyers argued over jurisdiction and liability, over who had known what and when. When she was asked to speak, she did so plainly. She described what she had seen. She described how it had felt to realize that something active and dangerous had been hidden beneath land, marked as unstable and abandoned. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. She trusted the facts to carry their own weight, and they did. Orders were issued. Operations were halted. Equipment was seized. Access points were identified and secured. The tunnels were mapped in full, their contents cataloged, their hazards addressed. Environmental remediation began almost immediately, teams working to contain contamination before it could spread further. The company at the center of the investigation released statements that grew more cautious with each passing day. Offers of private settlement followed, couched in language that suggested mutual benefit and quiet resolution. Eleanor declined them all. She was not interested in silence. Sergeant Mason remained a peripheral presence throughout the process, never seeking attention, never appearing in front of cameras. She saw him once more, briefly, during a site visit conducted under heavy supervision. He nodded to her from a distance, a small acknowledgement, nothing more. Later, she learned that his report had become a foundational document in the investigation. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was thorough. That mattered. Months passed. The seasons shifted, bringing cooler air and the first hints of frost to the higher elevations. With them came changes to the land itself. Areas that had been stripped or compacted during decades of hidden activity were stabilized, replanted, monitored. It would take years, perhaps decades, for the mountain to recover fully. But the process had begun. Eleanor's life changed in quieter ways. She returned to her apartment and packed away the remnants of the life she had put on hold. The drafting table by the window found new purpose, its surface cleared and cleaned. She began consulting again, slowly at first, offering her expertise to environmental assessment teams tasked with evaluating the structural risks of legacy industrial sites. Her experience, once undervalued, was suddenly sought after. She did not seek recognition, but it found her anyway in small, uncomfortable doses. Invitations to speak, requests for interviews, articles that referred to her as the woman who had uncovered the mountain's secret. She accepted some, declined others. She learned gradually to choose where her voice would be most useful. One afternoon, nearly a year after the day she had followed the rails into the earth, Eleanor returned to the mountain alone. The road was officially open now, though still monitored. She hiked the familiar trail with careful steps, her ankle finally strong enough to carry her without pain. The markers she had noticed on her first ascent were gone, replaced by signage that clearly identified the area as protected land under federal oversight. She reached the point where the rails had once cut across the slope. Nothing remained. The ground had been restored, the metal removed, the scar softened by new growth. If she had not known where to look, she might have missed it entirely. She stood there for a long time, letting the quiet settle around her. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not watchful, just still. Eleanor knelt and placed her hand on the earth, feeling its firmness beneath her palm. She thought of how much had been taken without permission, how long it had been hidden. She thought of the systems that had allowed it to happen, and of the single moment when she had chosen not to turn away. She realized then that the mountain had never truly been silent. It had been speaking all along, through instability and absence, through the unnatural straightness of rails and the emptiness of a place meant to be alive. It had waited for someone to notice. Eleanor rose and continued along the trail, moving steadily, her breath even. She did not look back. The land would remember what had been done to it. So would the people responsible. Records would be kept, oversight enforced. It would never be exactly as it had been before, but it would endure. As she descended toward the trailhead, sunlight filtering through the trees, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, not closure, but alignment. She had not set out to be a witness. She had not planned to expose anything. She had only chosen to look closely when something felt wrong. Sometimes she understood now. That was enough. The mountain stood behind her, quiet once more, its secrets no longer buried, its memory intact. And Eleanor walked on, carrying with her the knowledge that even the deepest silence could speak if someone was willing to listen. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Watch our upcoming videos to uncover what lies beneath other forgotten places. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story.